Well, the question of civil rights and ethics of AI is increasingly being discussed as the technology is being implemented in more and more areas. And these issues were also of concern of the National Security Council on Artificial Intelligence. Welcome back, José-Marie. You said that the way in which we implement AI is going to reinforce or diminish the set of values people have. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Yes, certainly. Well, first of all, we all have to recognize that technologies per se don't possess an ideology. But how we design a technology, what we design a technology to do and for whom, how we test that technology, where and how the technology is employed, what laws govern its use, all of those things reflect the priorities and values of the people who both design, test, and employ it. We know this from the facial recognition systems, which originally started out as law enforcement tools, became very, very accurate for the testing that was done. So in the United States, very, very good, particularly at identifying white males. A little bit, yeah, less accurate at identifying white females, less accurate in African American faces, particularly females, and almost non-existent for Native American facial recognition. So again, the technology might have been there for a good idea, but the data sets that was tested on were effective only for certain populations, and then abused, the same technology used and abused ultimately in China for the persecution of the Uyghurs. So that's how technology can either reinforce the set of values you have if you move to create the appropriate restraints on the powers that have access to these technologies, and if you make sure that the process through which technology evolves from conception to use are actually done in a way, I believe, that needs to be more transparent and more open and support the kinds of values you want to support in a democratic society: free speech, individual rights, privacy, and the tolerance for different points of view, for example.
How much is this issue being debated in the US today, would you say?
I think it's being debated quite a lot, particularly with artificial intelligence applications. There's a lot of public concern over how technology is being used and can be used. It's not just artificial intelligence, it's the full range of edge technologies that we have that are now gathering information. Sort of the growth of the surveillance state, if you like, causes the other concern. What do people need to know about me and why? And in the somewhat polarized environment we're at, we've got people who are in favor and people who are against. So before we've even started, we've already got perspectives that are entrenching very, very quickly. Bad examples, someone said, always make the media. Media loves to work with controversial and bad things. We don't hear too much about the successes in the media. There have been great successes as well that have worked, particularly in the healthcare environment. And I think that we need to have a more balanced approach to having sort of the public discussion of these issues needs to be put out there for more people to engage in. And I noticed, I did my research on Sweden before I came. In the United States, we tend to be a little bit, we sort of get slowed down with inertia and size and scope. We also are rather apathetic in some respects. Your population really engages in the political process to a significant extent. I read 80% vote. Yes. I think the voting level in the United States is just a little over 30%. I mean, I was actually shocked when I heard that number the first time. It's not a very
but
good.
You mentioned polarization.
Oh, yeah.
US, as in Sweden, as in very many other countries, there is a growing polarization within the public.
Yes.
A distrust towards authorities,
yes.
The government. We've seen that example through anti-vaxxers, for instance. How do you deal with that, and how do you ensure the public trust when it comes to even now a new technology? We can't even imagine what it could be used for.
Well, let me just, we do have this sort of diminishing trust in the body politic, diminishing trust in journalism, sort of rising trust actually in the education sector right now, which is good for people like me. But we've always had these problems, and in the United States there's also a certain lack of trust over big companies. And we talk about them as big. So we talk about big tobacco and big oil and big pharma and big tech. And then there's this faction of people who, as a result of it, don't trust what what the companies are doing. So just to let you know, we are polarized on that as well. But in terms of how do you build the public trust, and it is all about trust, it's very, very important. I think we have 4 stages of issues. The first one is sort of perceptual issues. There are people who don't quite believe that artificial intelligence exists, or if it does exist, it exists in Star Trek or something of that kind. It's sci-fi, it's futuristic, it's not here, or worst case, it's another fad, which is even worse, I think. So that's the perceptual issue. Then we have the educational issues, what AI is and what AI isn't, the fact that it is here already and you're using it, and people don't realize that. So we need to sort of give people some idea of how AI works, how the algorithms actually function. They're just learning about search algorithms, but they need to know that. How the technology is used and how it could be abused. I think we have to be open about that and just sort of lay it out there. And then what kind of oversight exists for the application and use of these technologies. So that's the educational issue. And I think you can do a certain amount of that with the general public. You don't want to get too deep or too technical or we'll turn them off. But a few good examples of good applications or applications that work well and those that haven't would be good. And then we have, I think, the principles that will lead to improved trust. So the principle of transparency. My favorite subject with artificial intelligence is testing, evaluation, validation, and verification, TEVV. I love it. I think it's a great area, very, very critical, but not very sexy. So, I like to make sure it gets into every one of my talks. That universities and research groups that would like to play a role is a perfect role for an independent group. Oversight and auditing and reporting requirements are important, and I believe a lot of very diverse oversight groups. And I wanted to mention that our Department of Defense, our military, a few years ago established a civilian oversight board called the Defense Innovation Board. It's because of the conversations at that level that I think ultimately led to the development of our commission. But I think having an oversight board, not at the end of a project, to check the results, that's when you do your audits, but at the beginning, what kinds of innovations should the Department of Defense engage in is another way of trying to build public trust, that we've had this oversight board. And we need review mechanisms. We need the ability for individuals who've been affected by the technologies in ways they don't believe is good to appeal and have a grievance process. And also we need, I believe, open acknowledgement of the failures. I think if we don't acknowledge failures, when and there will be failures, every technology fails, no technology is perfect, to say, it didn't work for this purpose, it didn't work because of this, we're addressing the problem, would do an awful lot to build public trust. And then, as I say, finally, oversight by this diverse group of people who've got backgrounds in ethics, law, policy, economics, cognitive science, advocacy groups, and so on. Well, those are all the elements, I think, that begin to build the public trust. But we have to remember, trust is a very precious thing. It's very hard to earn, and it's very easy to lose. And I honestly believe it's a little bit like our immune system. If you get cancer or something and you go into remission, your immune system never, ever recovers to its original situation. And I believe trust, once broken, is never, ever quite fully regained. So you can't lose trust very often or with too many groups. We have to be very, very careful as we move forward with the development of AI that has the potential for great things, but also the potential for abuse and misuse.
How worried are you personally for this risk of abuse or misusing the technology?
Well, I think all technologies are misused and abused. I could cite the internet. The internet is a wonderful vehicle, and it does great things, and it enables a lot of things. At the same time, we've got this growing dark web where things that happen, illegal things, unethical things, just horrible things going on, and they both coexist in this sort of same platform. So I think technology will be abused. I think all we can do is to try and mitigate the damage that could be done, and go in knowingly to develop technologies so that technology can be used for the most part for good. There's the optimist in me, but a little bit of the skeptic that we have to make sure that we don't ignore the fact that there may be people who wish to do harm, and unfortunately there'll always be people who wish to do harm, that we try and ensure that they don't get access to misuse the technologies in the way they could be misused.
The Commission has given quite a lot of recommendations in this area. It's a full chapter. I can recommend everyone to read it. But would you prefer this to be part of the legislation or more guiding principles?
Well, we ended up making them heavily guided principles because you can't legislate everything. It slows the process down. But even getting a set of principles was quite difficult among the Commission members. I don't think I'm giving anything away. A lot of people who are very much into the technology, its development, understand its full potential, tend not to sit back and think about principles. And principles tend to be soft, a bit what we would say squidgy in English. That's like a sponge, you know, you can squeeze it and it changes shape and so on. And it's hard sometimes for hardcore technologists to talk about soft social issues. So we did have a line of effort on ethics, and we worked at it, and it took us quite a while to get some of the other commissioners to understand what we were doing, to understand we couldn't come up with full definitions. That would take forever. So that we had to start with a set of principles. You've had a set of principles in Europe. NATO has a set of guiding principles. I think the more we share these guiding principles, China has a set of guiding principles in use. The issue was, are we going to follow them? And are we going to be held accountable for following them? And what kinds of mechanisms are we going to use to ensure that we're upholding the principles that we say we're going to uphold?
What did you end up with?
Okay, well, we ended up, these are my recommendations, by the way. I carry them around with me because somebody always says, be specific. So in the area of upholding demographic values, we had improved the public transparency about how the government uses AI. Develop and test systems with the goal of advancing privacy, preservation, and fairness. Strengthen the ability of those impacted by government actions involving AI to seek redress and have due process. And strengthen oversight mechanisms to address current and evolving concerns. Under justified confidence in AI systems, this is sort of trusted AI, if you like, focus more federal R&D investments on advancing AI security and robustness. Again, another topic that took a while for the Commission to come back to.
Why were they hesitant?
I think that there's a tendency for those people who are involved with the technology to promote it. They're advocates for the technology. That's what they're doing. They've been doing that all their careers, advocates for research, advocates for legislation, etc. So sometimes it's difficult to put on the other hat and say, well, what if? And what about these other areas of concern? We think this would be great for the federal government. Well, what about the unions? They have concerns. We can't dismiss them. Let's talk to the unions. Let's find out what the concerns are. Let's explain how the technology is used.
A method you used
We did during our work. We put out our research findings very early on. I think after the first 3 months, we had our first report. We asked people to comment on the findings. We had a lot of people come in and testify to us. We then put out some of our preliminary recommendations, and every quarter we issued a report with findings or preliminary recommendations to gather feedback from as many communities as we could reach. And we gathered all that feedback, we discussed it, we talked about how we might modify some of our ideas of recommendations. We might add some, we might delete some. So that was the whole process by which we developed this report. And then at the end, we produced a final set of recommendations. But we decided early on that we did not want to be a commission that sat almost in secret for 2 years and then suddenly produced a report. So our idea was to create a process that would facilitate the distribution of the work that we were doing while we were doing it, again, providing some sort of oversight responsibility on us, if you like, and that we would issue recommendations as we went along, because some of our in fact, the earliest recommendations were made 6 months after we started, and they were what we called the low-hanging fruit. Where were the problems in the federal government that would help us, if we addressed it quickly, help enable what we really wanted to do? And so we had some very simple things early on, like double the funding for this scholarship program. and expand it from covering only cybersecurity to cover AI.
Easy to say, but not that easy to accomplish, maybe.
Well, you know, it's just one area, but we picked a few of those, and several of them were accepted. We worked to have our recommendations incorporated, not necessarily through new legislation, which is a long process, but to try and find legislation that already existed, and so that we could perhaps add a clause, tweak something, sort of expand something, and then that was much more quickly accepted. So a lot of our recommendations are in the National Defense Authorization Act, because that governs the Department of Defense. And a lot of what we were doing was looking at AI for national security, which is the Department of Defense predominantly.
And a lot of your recommendation has, as you said, turned into legislation.
They made a measure last week, because we're now decommissioned, and they said that we had incorporated or inspired 190 elements of legislation in the 2.5 years.
But speaking of the sense of urgency and the time factor, and still enabling people to trust this and ensure civil rights, how do you balance innovation and the need for speed, so to speak, with civil rights? It's a vast area.
Yeah, it's hard, and it's all a balance. It's always a balance. So I think that thinking through the concerns that various groups might have over a development in AI by bringing them in and having them have conversations, whether it's an oversight group, an advisory group, some kind of talk to the advocacy groups that are advocating for privacy, etc. But take that into consideration in planning and designing the technology, or perhaps in the early stages of testing, so that you make sure things are adequately tested. Not all the data sets might be there, but that's another reason why we want to see collections of tagged data made available to AI researchers and developers. We've recommended a national AI resource network, so that anyone in the academic and certain parts of the IT sector can have access to these resources and use them and share them without having to go and build them from scratch. So all of that, I think, helps give people a sense that we're doing things the right way. And then you do have to have your oversight board and your auditing of what happened. So transparency is very, very, very important. And as I say, any indication of the failures, because these technologies, many of them will fail. And we need to show, you know, we've tried a lot before we actually got to one that works well.
But should innovation be able to take precedence and then we'll sort along the problems? Or should one adopt a more better safe than sorry approach?
Well, actually, I mentioned this morning I'm an optimist. I'm a researcher at heart, so I go for innovation. But I do think we need to be cautious innovation. And, you know, you can't spend all your time trying to develop the perfect application, because you'd never get there. So at some point, you have to sort of consult, get all the input you can, make an informed decision and move with it, and then follow it and make sure it happens. I mean, executives do this in every aspect of what they do, and we're constantly juggling one priority over another. Which one do we put the resources into? And I tend to use an algorithm. I use a very simple approach. What's the cost, or what's the effort and resources, and what's the likely impact? And you want to go after high impact stuff, whether it's very costly or less costly. I'd start with the less costly, but something that's not very costly and not very impactful, I just rule out. I say, okay, unless we have to do it, why would we bother? Let's focus on the things that are impactful and will make a difference in these people's lives.
Thank you so much, José-Marie, for sharing with us.
Okay, thank you.